Welcome everybody to the Green Pastures storytelling session, or what is it actually called? What's your story remembering Green Pastures? So if you don't know who I am Josh Howard. I grew up here in Clifton Forge in Sharon. Did the story where I moved away when I turned 8, probably the day I turned 18, but now I'm back and I'm very happy to be back. And so this fantastic group of people are going to talk about Green Pastures or Longdale Recreation area, depending on what you want to call it, and share some stories not just about the past, but also about what we've been trying to do to essentially rejuvenate the area. So the way this is going to go, I'm going to give a very short, maybe 5-minute history of Green Pastures. Then we're going to pass it off to our wonderful storytellers down on this side, and then to Dr. McClinton, who will talk about some restoration efforts, and then to Joan Van Oorsdaal, who will talk about some oral history projects that have been going on. So, if you don't know what Green Pastures is, which I hope you all do, but if you don't, Green Pastures is out in the community called Longdale, if you go out on the far eastern side of this county. And so the story of this park, and it is a USDA Forest Service park, is I want you to think back to 1933. That's when the foundations of this park came from. And get yourself in the brain space. Great Depression, the New Deal, the president is FDR. And essentially what's going on is there's a lot of money being spent on forest conservation, on recreation, on things like that. And everybody's very excited. But by the time you get up to about 1935, 36, a lot of African American leaders, specifically those within the NAACP, are recognizing that essentially none of that money is being spent on African American recreation, because again, we are in the Jim Crow South in Virginia at the time. And so what starts happening, because there's no construction happening, there's nothing being done for African Americans, is there's a protest movement that begins, largely spurred on by the NAACP. At sites such as Cave Mountain and Shenandoah Lake. This brings together the USDA Forest Service, the National Park Service, Virginia State Parks, the Virginia Forest Service, who all decide we need to do something, we need to build a new African American recreational area. So ultimately they decide the USDA Forest Service is going to be the one to do this. And that is essentially where the idea of Green Pastures came from. It came out of this meeting. So the Forest Service contacts the Civilian Conservation Corps, which I would love to get into the history of that. It's one of my favorite things, but we don't have time. So CCC workers, about 200 of them from the Dolly Ann camp up in Covington, come down to Longdale and they build Green Pastures over the course of about a year to a year and a half. Green Pastures opens unofficially in 1938, officially in 1940, and for roughly a decade is an African American park that essentially partners with Dalford State Park, which you are all hopefully familiar with as well. In 1950, the USDA Forest Service has an unofficial desegregation of all Forest Service sites, and so the park opens up to everybody. In theory, Dalford does as well, but functionally, Green Pastures remains an African American recreation area. Dalford remains a white recreation area for quite some time, for another few decades most likely. In 1963 is when the name is formally changed from Green Pastures to Longdale by the USDA Forest Service as essentially part of a rebranding effort, is what I would call it. Ever since then, the USDA Forest Service has been managing this site. I think we would all agree that the management has declined a little bit in recent years, that the last time they had a major renovation effort was sometime during the 1980s. This park is important for many reasons, for individual memories, for community memories, but it's also important because it is genuinely unique. I'm a historian, so one thing that really frustrates me is when somebody calls something the only of its kind, or the first of its kind, or the oldest, or something like that, because most things can claim that, but this is genuinely the only African American recreation area, the only African American park that existed in the Forest Service system, nationwide, not just Virginia, not the East Coast, we're talking national. That's a really big deal. That's really important. And I think it's important that we conserve this site and remember it and keep talking about it. One thing I will highlight really quickly is Preservation Virginia, which is a nonprofit organization that encourages the preservation of Virginia historic resources, just listed about maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, just listed Green Pastures on its listing of most endangered historic resources, which is great. And so we're excited that other people outside of Clifton Forge, Covington, Alleghany County are recognizing how important this site is. And so with that, I'm going to start turning it over to each of our speakers one by one. And we'll go first with Lorraine. Do you want to go first? Yeah, so our first speaker is Lorraine Spinner Howard. Lorraine was born and raised in Clifton Forge. She left for a little while. She went away to New York and to Florida for 35 years, but now she's home. And this is her Green Pastures story. Lorraine.
Good evening. My most recent memory of Green Pastures is in the early 2000s. And the reason I remember the date is because my youngest brother was with us, and he passed away in 2006. So I know it was in the early 2000s. Some of us didn't drive. I'm from a large family with 11 children, and so we would have to pile in everybody's car and go to Green Pastures. We would each take different food items. We would take games. And the girls used to like playing volleyball, badminton, cards, different things like that. Some of them would go in the water. I couldn't swim, so I didn't go too far. I would get my feet wet, but I wouldn't get too far out there in the water. We came down in the early 2000s. It was about maybe 30 or more of us, family members. We ate. Some of them got in the water. At this time, the water wasn't that inviting. It looked really dirty. So I know I didn't get in, but some people did. And the guys would throw horseshoes because that's what they like to do. Going back in my memory, where I think I was probably a teenager, my brother-in-law would come and pick us up in this old van. And the only seat the van had in it was the driver's seat. So he would pile us in, like it would be about maybe 10 or 12 of us, family members and some friends. And we'd be holding on for dear life to the sides because we didn't have seats, we were standing up. So we were like sardines in there. So we would go, but we would have a good time because we really didn't have that many places to go. And I also remember when my father would take us down, he had an old Packard. I can't even tell you what color it was. My memory is fading a little bit. But it was a Packard, and this is when they had the big long seats. So I think maybe 4 or 5 people would get in the front, and the rest of us would get in the back, sitting on each other's laps. But we really didn't mind that because we just wanted to go someplace. Just wanted to do something. Everybody stayed out of trouble. We didn't have any fights. I don't remember any arguments. It was just good times. And I missed the park. I don't know exactly when they closed it, but I'm sure that a lot of us have fond memories of Green Pastures Park.
Thank you, Lorraine. So next up is Pam Marshall. So Pam is heavily involved in the Green Pastures restoration movement. She's also a committee member for the What's Your Story project, which Joan will tell us more about here in a minute. Pam is also a retired FBI agent, so don't mess around with Pam. And she is currently a staff writer for the Virginia Review, so you've probably read something that recently that Pam has written. So Pam Marshall.
Thank you. My memories of Green Pastures, I was a little girl, and what I remember is the nuclear family was intact. And maybe I remember that because I didn't grow up in my family with my mother and father. I grew up with another family. But when I went to Green Pastures, I went with my mother and father, and it seemed that everybody had both parents at the park. And if you got too far away from your parents, some other parent would ask where your parents were, and they would feed you and then make sure you got back to where your parents were. Over the years, I hadn't been to Green Pastures until maybe 2 years ago. Is that when the Renewal Festival was? And that's when I went back, and it was a far cry from the heyday that I remember. The water was stagnant and most of the park was closed off. It was very sad. It was a sad departure from the heydays of Green Pastures.
Thank you, Pam. Next up is Stevie Nicely. Stevie Nicely is a longtime resident of the Longdale community. I asked if I could call him the mayor of Longdale, and he said no, so that's fair. Stevie was part of the first ever graduating class from Dabney in forestry, and so I don't think you could find anybody else who knows more about the forest out there in the Longdale area and the Green Pastures area. So Stevie Nicely.
Thank you. My memories come from even back before I was able to go to the park on my own. My granddad, he rented a house, lived in a house that was right at the entry to the park. My mom and my aunt are here today. They're part of a four-sister family that grew up in that house. My uncle Boots, William Thomas Helm, he was killed in World War II. He also growed up in the Forest Service house. It was just every memory I have of growing up had something to do with the woods and area around the park there. In the evenings when the school bus would run, my granddad would come pick me up. We'd go to the woods. He'd take me hunting during the hunting season. He had chickens and gardens and all at the entry to the park. Now you can hardly tell that there was ever anything there. And in our teenage years, we'd get our chores done, whatever we had to do, and all the community teenagers or whatever would go. And we would play ball. On Sundays we'd go and we'd play football in the winter when the gates were closed. We'd go up. It's one of the only big fields in Longdale. We played baseball. We had a rule, you better not hit the ball too hard because the game will be over. If we can't find it, we can't play. So that's kind of the way we learned our sports. We learned about the woods. Robbie's, I guess Ronnie is your uncle? Ronnie Wilhelm. Yeah, Ronnie Wilhelm, he grew up there. I think he was the last lifeguard at Longdale when the beach was open and they was running everything there. He later become a fish biologist. And a lot of people, their whole lives have been pretty much formed from the country in and around there and what was going on in Longdale. Somebody mentioned in the book about a tree across the lake. We had a big oak tree and we had a big rope up in that tree. And we'd go over, we'd swim, and we'd get up on that bank and we'd swing on that rope and all the tricks we could do. Every boy tried to outdo the next. And, you know, my mom can tell you about every summer, she didn't go by the weather, she went by the trips to the emergency room that I had. I seen a picture here where the park froze over. Well, all us kids, we went up to the park. There was a grapevine over the upper end of the park. I weighed a little more than the rest of the kids. They all swung out on the grapevine and ice on the lake and whatever, and they made it back. Well, I swing out. The grapevine gives way. I go in the lake in wintertime. So I get out. Time I got home, my clothes were froze on me. And it was just memories like that. It's just, it was an amazing place. The only time we really never went up there too much was the 4th of July. And it wasn't because there was any problem or anything. It just lots of 4th of Julys. There was so many people up there, you'd get stepped on. You know, it was just it was just a great place. And we want to bring it back. And Mr. McClellan, he'll explain some of that. We've had a couple days out there that we've had work days. A lot going on. Every fourth Thursday at Sharon Church, we have a meeting and we discuss what's going on at the park. And we invite anybody who would like to participate to show up. Now, I'm about out of memories now.
Thank you, Stevie. Yeah, to follow up on that real quick, there is an organization I should have mentioned called Friends of Green Pastures, or the abbreviation is FOGPAL. So if you Google that, if you look around on Facebook, there's some information there. Or if you're just interested in it, seriously, talk to anybody on this stage and we will connect you with that organization. So next up, we have Reverend Rosalind Thomas. Reverend Thomas has been in Clifton Forge for quite a while. She is the Reverend at First Baptist, and she does have, she and our next speaker, Ms. Moore, have a distinct family connection to Green Pastures. Or I'm sorry, you passed the microphone over.
Yeah, I'm Rosalind.
Yeah, okay, we're good. Go ahead, Reverend Thomas.
Okay, first of all, I want to say I'm just excited that we're doing this today and that the reconstruction has begun on the park. I thought about the reason why the park was created. First, I want to say that I think that the area that they chose had to been something that God ordained, and because of the mindsets of the people. Because you got to understand that the ideology of the people in 1938 and the early 40, it was slavery time. And so blacks had nowhere to go. They would work, from morning until late evening, and then they had no recreation. And the other thing was that at that time, even the biblical teachings, it was one where the slaves were controlled in their Bible knowledge from a white ideology. And so we grew up not hating any race. And in this area, I think it's predominantly been a place of love. And I think that this establishment of the first national park for us is something that speaks volumes about our area. So they worked with the U.S. Forestry when they came to the NAACP to establish a place for us to go and rest. And that is I believe, the formation of the name Green Pastures. It comes from Psalm 23, where it says that the Lord will lead us to green pastures and to still waters. And the African people needed a place to rest, because even the Bible speaks of how Jesus went into the back of the boat to do what? To rest. And so it became a place for us initially, but in my age, when I was growing up, if you get the book, you'll see where I said I didn't see that it was a divided area. Segregation in the years before my coming up, segregation it was gone. We were desegregated at my age. I was born in 1963. And so when we went to the park, though, there was a divide in where we actually set up our picnics. And so I remember driving into the park, and the whites would be at the front part of the park where you could play the big football, because it was a nice, beautiful, big field. And they would be playing baseball or football, and we would drive on past to go to the back end of the park and set up our picnic tables and picnics and be by the beach area. But we shared the common area, which was the big restroom area and the beach area, and there was never any problems. And you got to remember the time that this was, and for this area I never recall anybody getting in arguments, not amongst our own race or any other race, because the area is just a beautiful place. And the fact I've been sharing with my cohorts from college that, we have this awesome book and what it was about, and asking them, did they realize where I live is where they established one of the first national parks for African Americans. They were like, wow, because that's a beautiful thing. And so I'm excited about the restoration, and about getting it opened and just sharing continuously this area. We have to do things that are going to, in this time and age, that are going to draw people to our area. It's a beautiful place with the mountains. It's just awesome. And so that park is just, it's a beautiful place for us. I don't know what kind of flowers and all of that, but I'm sure that they're going to do studies about the birds, the flowers, anything that we can do to draw people back to this area, because it's a wonderful, wonderful place to have grown up and to live. I think in the book I cited about I didn't go off the dam or any of that stuff because I couldn't swim. So I didn't do any of that, but I certainly enjoyed the fellowship. Most of the African American churches made sure that they traveled to that area. And obviously, when I was sharing with someone from Stanton, they stated that the churches from as far as Stanton and even further on would drive into this area to that park because that was the only park, like they said, in the nation. And so I just want to thank you all for allowing me to have a few moments to say something, and hopefully we'll get the word out that the park is being renovated and that we will do whatever part that we can. First Baptist Church, which is where our pastor is the pastor, where my uncle, who was the pastor at that time, in the 1940s, that worked with the United States Forestry to help them to realize the park. And so we're excited about the renovation. Thank you.